All black, everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
We've been gone a long time. We back now. You twins? Nah, we cousins.
There are legends of people with the gift of making music so true. It can conjure spirits from the past and the future. This gift can bring fame and fortune.
Well, somebody take me in your eyes.
But it also can pierce the veil between life and death.
Thank you so much for making this space feel so alive today. I'm Lou Brown. I'm the Director of Programming for the Forum at FHI, and we're happy to be collaborating with Left of Black and the Basque Connections Rosetta Wright's Archival Research Project for this program today. Let me introduce our wonderful panelists. First, I'm going to introduce Frank Cason, who's down at the far left, my far left. Franklin Cason Jr. is an assistant professor of the practice in the Department of Art History, and Visual Studies at Duke. In 2019-20, he earned a PhD from the University of Florida and an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Franklin's research explores aesthetics and pragmatism in African American cinema. His essay, Symbiopsychotaxiplasticity, Some Takes on William Greaves, co-authored with Tsitsi Jaji, was recently published in Cultural Studies in a special issue on Theorizing Production. Beyond Category, Black Souls on Screen was published in Black Camera, and Ghosts in the Machine, When Documenting Past Black Life Haunts Its Present, was published in the documentary journal World Records. Next, we have music artist and storyteller Lois Deloatch. In 2024, Lois Deloatch marked 30 years in music with Love Always, her 6th recording as leader. She is recognized internationally for her soulful contralto voice, provocative compositions, and eclectic blend of jazz, folk, blues, and spirituals. Deloatch has shared the stage with luminaries such as Ellis Marsalis, Arturo Sandoval, Dr. Billy Taylor, and others. She writes and lectures on music, arts, and culture, and she produced and co-hosted a jazz radio show, Sunday Evening Classics, on WNCU. The Independent Weekly said that Lois Deloatch is more than a jazz singer. Her fluid interpretation of a vocalist's role transcends being only a medium for the music. She often becomes a caretaker of the music's history, an advocate of its redemptive power. Deloatch also has held distinguished careers in higher education and nonprofit management. Her work consistently bridges cultural expression, social impact, and economic empowerment. She serves on boards and advisory committees for numerous organizations working to strengthen communities and advance peace. Deloatch earned a Bachelor of Arts from UNC Chapel Hill and a Master of Arts from Duke University. Joseph Richard Winters is the Alexander F. Hemeyer Associate Professor of Religious Studies and African American Studies at Duke. He also holds secondary positions in English and in gender, sexuality, and feminist studies. His interests lie at the intersection of Black religious thought, African American literature, and critical theory. Overall, his project expands conventional understandings of Black religiosity and Black piety by drawing on resources from African American literature, philosophy, and critical theory. His research examines how literature, film, and music, especially hip hop, can reconfigure our sense of the sacred and imagination of spirituality. Winter's first book, Hope Draped in Black, Race, Melancholy, and the Agony of Progress, published by Duke University Press in 2016, examines how Black literature and aesthetic practices challenge post-racial fantasies and triumphant accounts of freedom. The book shows how authors like W.E.B. Du Bois and Toni Morrison link hope and possibility to melancholy, remembrance, and recalcitrant sense of the tragic. His second book project, under contract with Duke University Press, is called Disturbing Profanity, Hip-Hop, Black Aesthetics, and the Volatile Sacred. Now for our host, Mark Anthony Neal. I'm just going to talk for the next hour about it's done. I will say, When I pulled up his speaker page on the forum website, I was reminded of just how many programs he's created, hosted, and participated in since our inception, which he was partly responsible for. As always, we're grateful for his leadership in public scholarship and the spirit of generosity he always brings to his work inside and outside the university. When I wrote Mark to say, you think we can pull this together in short time? He said, I'm in, let's make it happen. And that's pretty much what you get when you reach out to Mark. But he's more than that. So Mark Anthony Neal is James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of African and African American Studies, Professor of English and Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies, and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Duke University for about another month and a half. Yes. On July 1st, he assumes the role of Chair of Duke's Academic Council, which is the university's faculty senate. Neal is the author of 6 books, including Black Ephemera, The Crisis and Challenge of the Musical Archive, What the Music Said, Black Popular Music and Public Culture, Soul Babies, Black Popular Culture and Post-Soul Aesthetic, and Looking for Leroy, Illegible Black Masculinities, and co-editor with Murray Foreman and Regina Bradley of That's the Joint, the Hip Hop Studies Reader, which is now in its 3rd edition. Neal has been featured in several documentaries, including PBS's Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes, Netflix's The Two Killings of Sam Cooke, A&E's Right to Offend, The Black Comedy Revolution, PBS's Gospel, Sly Lives, a.k.a. Sly Lives, Sly Lives? The Burden of Black Genius, directed by Amir Questlove Thompson, and We Want the Funk, directed by Stanley Nelson. And he even portrayed himself in an episode of the BET scripted drama Being Mary Jane. Was that the hardest role? At Duke, Mark directs the Center for Arts, Digital Culture, and Entrepreneurship, which produces original digital content, including the weekly 2024 Davie Award-winning video podcast Left of Black, which is now in its 15th season, produced in collaboration with the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke, and recorded often always with the support of Eric Barstow. His forthcoming book, Save a Seat for Me, Meditations on Black Masculinity and Fatherhood, will be published next year by Simon & Schuster. He's a member of the Delta Zeta Sigma graduate chapter of Durham NC of Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated. Phew. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark now, who will run the rest of this conversation. And thanks again, everybody, and all of you for your time.
So welcome and good afternoon for an afternoon of conversation about the culture. And I wanted to start the conversation with my colleagues really doubling down on what is their lane and addressing how they see it from their perception centers, from the perception of their expertise. Franklin, you're a filmmaker. As a filmmaker, what did you experience watching Sinners?
I know we're going to talk about the scene later on,
right.
But in certain ways, that scene and the importance of music in general was a significant, I think, moment just in terms of cinema. Both the way it was shot, but also, I think, for me, in my research on African American cinema, one of the things that I've been really interested in is this idea of and there are different ways of describing sort of, blackness, sort of an aesthetic, and how that plays out in terms of film practice. And I've been really looking at that, particularly in the idea around soul, because specifically, it's hard to, to put your, put it in a box. And music in this film, for me, like heightened that element because in certain ways, there's a lot of, over the years in films, there have been a lot of attempts to try to talk about film through using sort of music references or, Arthur Jaffa, sort of the famous filmmaker, cinematographer in Daughters of the Dust, has written a lot about the importance of music to understanding African American aesthetics, and so this idea of blackness. And for me, like the idea of soul adds to that in the sense that it's really hard to talk about. And so, just a preview to the discussion of the scene. One of the things that makes that particular scene so important for me, and it sort of paints the whole film for me, is that I know Coogler's talked about the importance of Delta blues in terms of American popular culture, but no one really says it in the movie. But for me, that's the thing. I mean, you can't, when you're talking about the black aesthetics, if you're trying to sort of like pin it down, that's the difficult part. And the beauty of that scene and the way, again, that it opens up the movie is that it expresses it. It uses music to basically make the case. And so for me, the thing that makes that film so important is because it's one of the clearest examples of sort of the use of music to talk about film aesthetics, particularly African American film aesthetics, because it reaches out. You know, it sort of gives it a context, the past, present, and the future, and it kind of makes the case that it emanates from a particular place. And that was the whole thing about soul. You know, I mean, you know all about soul, Mark. But it's the whole thing. Like, do you got it? You don't have it. You know, who has it? Who doesn't have it? And all these kinds of things. And so this idea of a vampire trying to get the soul. I mean, it's so. Yeah, for me, it's the film is like a film about soul, but the heart of it is the music. So yeah, I don't know if that sort of.
Yeah.
Because I really see that as a cinematic. I mean, Coogler's a filmmaker, but he also understands that part of filmmaking is, the expression, which includes music and all this. I mean, the soundtracks and all those things.
Lois, we've talked in the past about how Sinners seems to be an excuse, the vampire narrative, to have a multi-generational conversation about the blues and what's been lost in the context in which we've literally given it away, right? You go to any of these major blues festivals, right, and you look at the audience, you know that young black folks aren't listening to blues music and have not been so for 2 generations. Talk a little bit about how significant it is to engage the blues in the context of this film.
Thank you, and I'm so honored to be on this panel. This film is deep and wide with blues and music culture at the center of it. Music as an element, one aspect of culture, just like food is a part of culture, you know, how you, traditions and rituals are a part of your culture. But you grounding it with the music gives it so many different places to go. And this whole, I'm glad you mentioned soul music. I'll answer your question, but one of the things that came to me in the car on the way over was 3 names: Thelonious Monk, Sam Cooke, and Aretha Franklin. So as we know, Thelonious Monk from North Carolina, one of the iconic jazz, legendary jazz players, jazz innovators, grounded, all jazz is grounded in blues, right? Blues is grounded in African traditions, right? So the soul of the matter is that our music and our culture, and blues being one of the greatest assets of American culture now, I agree that it's underappreciated. But back to Thelonious Monk. A lot of folks don't know that early in his career as a teenager, Monk traveled as a pianist for an evangelist, doing tent meetings. I only know this because I did some research with Sam Stevens, who did the Jazz Loft Project here through the Center for Documentary Studies. And when I was doing my master's degree, one of the things that I was doing with Sam was this research. So I talked to people like Lou Donaldson, all these jazz greats who remembered Monk, to talk about, and Lou Donaldson in particular talked about how it was clear that Monk's music again, legendary jazz person who grounded jazz, was based in church music. So getting to that point about, sacred, secular music in general, soul music, whether it's in the context of a religious space or spirituality or just overall. Similarly for Aretha Franklin, any of us who really know Aretha's music, the things you heard on the radio, and then you also have seen her sing with James Cleveland and all the gospel things that she did. One of Aretha Franklin's earliest albums on Atlantic Records was a blues album, right? So it was all about blues, but blues was not popular in the way that even jazz was at that time. And then your man, Sam Cooke, right? There was this big conversation around Sam Cooke, the fact that he went from the soul stirrers to secular music. And particularly upon his death, there was all this conversation around where he was grounded and for whom he was using his music and singing. So I lay all that out there, not so much to answer the question about blues, but to talk about it in the context of this film. That's the hallmark of good art, right? It gives us a place from which to have conversation, discussion. My perspective of it may not be your perspective. We can look at a beard and paint and see two different things. So what I'm seeing in Sinners may not be what you're seeing, even from the musicality perspective of it. But I think the blues, grounding this in music and the blues, really was a foundation from so many ways to go. In fact, blues being depression, the feelings of oppressed people, right? So it's just so much richness that can be gleaned from this film. And grounding it in blues, I think, was really just brilliant. And I heard Coogler in an interview, and he said that one of his motivations, he was paying homage to an uncle who had died, you probably saw this, who exposed him to blues, and he used to play the blues, and it was his way of conjuring and connecting with his loved one. So the blues as an art form, but also as a device, as a film-making device, I think was used just brilliantly in this film.
Joe, the origin narrative, apocryphal as it is, of blues music, of course, is Robert Johnson selling his soul to the devil to play an instrument in ways that it had never been played before. And the important part of that story is that he sold his soul to the devil, right? Blues music was seen as devil music. When the great Thomas Dorsey, goes from being Ma Rainey's musical director to becoming the Thomas Dorsey that we know, the critique of that early music that he was writing was that he was bluesing or jazzing the spirituals, right? The Ray Charles narrative, right? When folks hear I Got a Woman, it's like, that was the Southern tones, right? What are you doing here, right? Talk about the sacred and the secular in the context of Black blues music, and of course the ways that Coogler navigates this discussion, particularly in relationship between Sammy and his father, who's played brilliantly by the great Saul Williams.
So thank you. First, I want to thank Lou for the invitation to be here with these esteemed panelists, and just to talk about a film that I think is in many ways epic and so important. So, to kind of continue the conversation, I thought a lot about, like you said, Thomas Dorsey. I also thought about W.C. Handy, right, who's seen as the father of blues, who learned how to play instruments and kind of organize music in the church, right? Maybe we can Aretha, we can talk about Mary J. Blige, right? Talk about he's a complicated figure, but even someone like Snoop Dogg, right? When he makes a gospel album, people are like, oh, well, he's like, I grew up listening to James Cleveland, right? So for me, what I'm interested in, I'll just kind of break it up into two. I mean, I'm interested within religious studies, right, Black religion, Black theology, that relationship between the sacred and profane and religious secular is always a kind of fraught conversation and discussion, right? So you get somebody like Black theologian James Cone, right? Some of you might know, right? Passed away a few years ago, associated with Black theology, the idea that God identifies with the oppressed, with the condition of Blackness. He has an essay where he suggests that, right? He says that you can think of the blues as a secular form of spirituals, right?
Yep.
Right. So he says, even if, because certainly there are blues songs that appeal to God and like, Lord have mercy and so forth. But he says, even if the blues are more secular, right, and aren't always appealing to something like a supernatural power, there's still a way of trying to deal with suffering, evil, and how you try to glean meaning, right, out of the catastrophic quality of white supremacy, right, and economic subjugation, if that makes sense, right? So I take it that what Cohn is trying to say is what connects blues, spirituals, and so forth is maybe something beyond, right, an appeal to something like a divine power, right, or a supernatural, or, right, there might be something like spirit or soul, right, that disrupts some of the categories that we use, right, that allow us to make certain kind of rigid divisions between the religious and the secular, sacred, profane. I hope I'm making sense, right? Yeah. The other, just in final, I'll just say one more thing, is that the category of the sacred, right, is just complicated, right? Right, so there's a personal quality to it. There's a socially constituted and so forth. Right, different spaces are sacred for different people. It's clear here that we know the juke joint, and the term juke, right, having Gullah origins meaning disorderly, right, or unruly, is a sacred space, right? And so I'll just leave with this.
As is the strip club.
As is the strip club, right. So there's this work. No, so we'll talk about. We'll talk. No. Without it. And so that's another. Because we'll get to that scene with the twerking and so forth, right? But I will say that within the term sacred already has a certain doubleness internal to its definition, right? The sacred is usually associated with that which is set apart, right? That which is set apart is either being more valuable or a space or an object that has to be protected from some kind of contamination, right? Already, when you talk about something that's set apart, right, you could be referring to the space that you want to keep pure, right, or the very thing that you think is threatening, right? And I take it that Coogler is playing with that relationship between, right, because what the first conversation that Sammy has with the conversation he has with his father, right, he says, something like, he takes the guitar, which is in the church. He says, "Don't let the devil follow you home," right? The devil might follow you home, right? So anyway, so I just want to suggest that, like, sacred religion, right? I think there are ways to, that we can describe and define it that would suggest that would make the juke joint and blues not so unfamiliar within a conversation about religion and the sacred and so forth. So,
Can I ask you this? And that is in that same vein, when the hoodoo, meaning that people have different ways of practicing what they view as being sacred and rituals. And I think he was also commenting on that with the introducing hoodoo.
That's exactly right. And I think I'll just say real quickly, so Megan Goodwin, who's here, right here, Megan Goodwin has just had an interview with Yvonne Charoux, right, who wrote a very important book in 2001, called Black Magic, right, on hoodoo, on conjuring, right, and suggesting there's something about, right, the tradition of African American conjuring that kind of rejects another distinction that's often made between religion and magic, right? It includes all of that, right? It includes, right, and there's also a way in which even the distinction between voodoo and Christianity gets messed with because all those elements are coming into these traditions. But I think, yeah.
So the scene. And I'm sure for a generation of folks who are very comfortable with sharing digital imagery, the scene has been a bit of a challenge, right? Because unless you were up in the theater with your phone, unless you have seen the film, you don't really know what anybody's talking about. But one measure of this is, the New York Times actually did, they do a series, Anatomy of a Scene. And they interviewed Ryan Coogler to do an anatomy of the scene of that scene.
So this is Sammy performing I Lied to You, which is our midpoint of the film, and it's kind of a hero moment for him. This song was written by the great Raphael Sadiq and Ludwig Göransson, our composer, and Raphael is from Oakland, kind of a local legend where I'm from. So
I posted it on one of my social media platforms. It has 1 million views, right? It is the most eyeballs I've ever gotten for anything I've posted in 15 years. What was your immediate reaction as you're watching the film and you realize what you're watching in that moment? I'm gonna go back to you, Franklin.
Well, to be honest, my first reaction was like, okay, where is this going? Because, once, and this is before I really figured out where it was going.
Right.
But at a certain point, I was just like excited because this is not a commercial move
Right.
in a film. He was taking chances to make to do that whole scene, so I was just happy. Like, okay, he's doing something different. You know, I mean, Coogler is, you know, in certain ways, you know, he's known for having layers of stuff, but stylistically, he's kind of still like a, you know, he knows how to make a big budget, well-made, you know, Hollywood picture. He's good at it. And so this, for me, in certain ways, was his most experimental moment as a filmmaker, so I was happy. I mean, initially confused, but very happily afterwards. And then it just kept going. And because it's what they call in filmmaking like a oneer, so like basically one shot, even though it wasn't technically a one shot. They just skillfully sort of
Edited, right.
you know, stitch things together. But the experience of it is like one sort of moment. And so it just kept building and building. And I mean, the lyrics and all the sort of music and all the kind of mixing. And basically, and you can sort of see, you know, a bit of Oakland sampling going on in it in terms of like borrowing from, I mean, the beauty of like sampling is the fact that, again, it's a question of your kind of, I mean, I'm going to say it, but I understand how cheesy it sounds, but you're kind of drawing from the ancestors. You're drawing from people who did stuff a while back, and you and you know, but you're making something that's, you know, for the future, that's going to live on, you know, so that the vampires don't have anything on that either. So you can sort of see that the whole scene is kind of encapsulating all this stuff. This, you know, the future of the music, future of the people, you know, and that ability, I think, in the narrative comes in and says like you're sort of breaking the wall between the past and the future and all that kind of stuff. So it was just, as I said before, one of the purest expressions of that sort of soul, the uncontainable quality of soul in a film. It was just a nice thing to see. And again, I also think that the fact that you get so many views, the fact that he was able to take that risk and it worked, and it really kind of changed the rest of the movie for me. I thought it deserves the name, the scene. It's an important part. I think it's an important filmmaking moment, just in general.
I mean, to your point, Franklin, the fact that he had final cut.
Yeah.
Right, because that definitely, had that not been the case, that would have been a scene, some suit in the studio would have been, I don't get it,
yep.
It doesn't work, it needs to go.
Yeah.
Right, so to the willingness of him to invest in his own artistic vision,
yeah.
not knowing how it's going to play out, right, taking risks, as you said, was
Yeah.
critically important. You know, Joe, we talked about the twerking, right, and, you know, like Franklin, I'm sitting in this scene and not quite sure where this is going, but then when the African musician showed up, I literally jumped out my seat, because that's the moment where I was like, oh, we're going through a portal now, right? Yeah. And we tend to elevate versions of high black art. Right, so we'll talk about the blues and jazz and traditional West African music, but then he's throwing in some twerking. Talk a little bit, Joe, you know, about how all of that fits together in that scene.
I've become the spokesperson of twerking. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm just joking. But no, I'm just joking. No, but I do think what you're getting at. I mean, first I would like to say, there's something about the film that's already disrupting any linear notion of time throughout, right? So even just the beginning with the narrative about, right, like different traditions of conjuring, and we're told that conjuring can happen both backward and forward. You can conjure the past as well as the future. So the way in which, right, the film begins the day after, right? And then you have these kind of cuts of like, you know, well, his face is cut, but you have these cuts of what happened before, right? But when I first saw that scene, because the first thing I saw was like the DJ with the Kango hat, right? And you saw the kind of funk guitar, and I was like, I was like, oh, okay. So I'm thinking in my professor had, I was like, this is the scene I can show in my next hip hop and religion class, right? Like this is fascinating. This is a beautiful kind of. It was interesting, right? So I saw it the first time a few weeks ago. I saw it again yesterday, right? And I don't think I noticed.
Regular screen or IMAX?
Regular screen, yeah, regular screen, right? So I didn't see IMAX. I didn't notice also the. It looked like potentially it looked like a geisha kind of figure in one scene, right? So I was like, so he's doing all these kinds of things with different cultural practices, entertainment ways of dealing with forms of suffering, subjugation, and so forth. So I'll just say this: I had a conversation with a family member, right, very close family member, who was just like, "Yeah, I like the film, but I didn't understand that part right there. What was he trying to do? Why did he have twerking in there, right?" And so, one of the things I said, and I don't know if this is necessarily right, but I said to myself, in a world in which the blues and jazz have become so sanitized and become part of a certain kind of a U.S. musical canon, we don't realize how unsettling at times, right? How unsettling the juke joint was for people, right? How unsettling certain dances were, right? The funky butt, the hoochie coochie, and so forth, right? Or even certain names, like Jelly Roll, more like we don't realize that this place was seen as the devil's place, lewd, obscene, and so forth, right? So by showing both, the twerking and so forth, one gets a sense not that there's some simple continuity through time, but there are echoes and repetitions throughout time regarding what kinds of black aesthetic forms, black rhythms and black choreographic forms are considered to be obscene, lewd, and so forth, or excessive.
You mentioned Jelly Roll. I always take the opportunity with my students to play at length Jelly Roll Morton's Go Get Me a Palette. And I prepare them by saying the most ratchet mumble rapper you've ever heard has nothing on this song that was recorded in the 1920s.
It wasn't Ma Rainey, there were a couple of others too. What they call the race records, right? And a lot of them really were what we would call, liquor house songs or whatever, nowadays. But to this point about this scene, so much about this film reminded me, again, this weaving of sacred and secular. So many points in this film reminded me of a sermon. Even, for example, when when they were in the car and passed the chain gang and that scene. But for me, it was almost like the scene was almost like, in some ways, and forgive me, church people, but it was almost like, no, I'm serious, because I'm a believer. It was like praise and worship, right? You really are beginning to get into the spirit, and there is music, and there is movement, and people move into the spirit in different ways. And when you are in the spirit, it doesn't, regardless, it doesn't matter if you're of a different place or, of a different race, or we're all in the spirit together. But, that was part of what I was reminded of watching that too. And also it just reflected on just the name of the movie, Sinners, right? Mm-hmm. The whole, Romans 3:23, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, right? So in this movie, really, it showed the humanity of nearly everyone. And also just that title, Sinners, for me, I think why so many people are drawn to this in this moment, because in the midst of, here they were, in the Jim Crow South, dealing with all the other stuff they're dealing with, trying to create their own little space, then came the damn vampires. Now look, don't we have enough to deal with? Right, so wait, just compare that to today. All right, we done had a pandemic, we got over the pandemic, we're already oppressed, we're trying to get reparations, then come whatever this is, right? What? Right, no, I'm very serious. I think for a lot of people, it's a representation of how absurd and what particularly people of color have to have the level of just tragedy and the level of just madness that we've had to deal with constantly in our existence in America. It was just, it was just extra. This film in general, I loved it because it was extra. I must say, I found it hard to watch. I had to leave the theater on the vampire scene because I'm an empath. I just cannot, the sound, it's not even the sight, it's the sound. So I had to leave and come back. I wasn't prepared for that. So then that's why I told anybody that I've talked to, I made the mistake of saying it's for everyone. I can't say that. It's not for everyone. But, but just this level of art. So there's just so much in this. It's just so much.
Mm-hmm. Watching conversations online with some of my more political theorist type colleagues and friends who really got caught up, not necessarily in the cultural messages of the film, but the political economy of the film. And, you know, one of the commentaries I remember reading is like, well, why were they so excited about going to the juke joint, right? Why aren't they doing something about all this cotton, right? And it raises a whole question about, like, when you're in that kind of life, your even capacity to think about, right, being a ground laborer and what the possibilities are with that, because you can't necessarily see that world at that point in time. But I think what gets missed in this point in time, right, because this is the other thing I loved about Coogler, he clearly studied and talked to people, right? He clearly read blues people. He clearly read Clyde Woods' development, Arrested, right? And for those who aren't familiar with that book, Woods, the late Clyde Woods, makes the argument that the blues aesthetic itself was as financially important as the material that cotton was. So we get the vampires, right? And to your point, Lois, it's like, oh shit, really? Right?
Yeah.
But it's also clear that the head vampire, right, wants that sound, wants that person that creates that sound, right? And we've had these conversations now for 30 years about black music and black culture and culture vultures, right? And again, from a filmmaking standpoint, a storytelling standpoint, some of it is a little messy, right? But that's kind of the point, right? Talk a little bit about this idea of the need to steal our sound, to own our sound, to commercialize our sound, and who benefits from it in the end.
Well, you know, we've talked about this, Mark Anthony. It's been even, you know, we talked about, you know, for generations, you know, whether it was the record companies stealing all the profits and artists signing deals that weren't in their best interest, to today, when artists almost have to give, whether they're black or white. You know, you're pretty much giving away your music as an advertisement.
And competing with AI-generated versions of the music.
Right, yeah. The whole thing about, you know, your intellectual property and your artistic creative, the value of that to the person who's creating it versus those who are just benefiting or being the vampires, right? But for some of that history, it was because many artists, particularly black artists, did not have the power or influence to walk indoors and do things for themselves. It's in the same way that, particularly like in jazz, there were lots of publishers who would put their names, you know, on things that Ellington and others wrote, and they had nothing to do, you know, nothing to do with that. So that's been an age-old issue and problem, and continues to be today. I think, fortunately, today, in some ways, now that artists do have more platforms and ways they can get music out and to be more creative. Yeah, we're competing with AI now too, but you really can self-promote in ways you couldn't before, create revenue in ways you can't before. Is it sufficient or enough for most people? No, it's just not.
I mean, Franklin, you teach courses about black independent filmmakers. What do those challenges look like in the filmmaking space?
Well, let me go back a little bit in terms of how this has played out in films, and again, another way that Coogler kind of flips it. There's a film, I written about this, I'm not even trying to say the date, I forgot. But it's Black and Tan Fantasy, Dudley Murphy. Dudley Murphy is an American filmmaker. He sort of wanted to make this film with Duke Ellington. The film gets a lot of credit for how it kind of has its own scenes. It's like where Freddie Washington is dancing around and, you know, and getting into the music. Ellington and the band are sort of getting into it. And, the camera gets crazy. They use a lot of special effects on the lenses, so it's almost like a prism. And it's this whole thing of like, black music is just kind of like crazy, It gets, you get the spirit, and she gets it, and she dies. I mean, spoiler alert. She collapses, and it's it's set out throughout in the beginning that she's got a heart condition, whatever.
Duke, play me the Black and Tan Fantasy.
For Murphy, he was attracted to this in black music as an experimental form because of the way that it, it's the classic sort of like, I can feel something with this stuff. I mean, like with the stuff around me, I need something, and for him, like this was as experimental as anything else happening in like, in Europe in terms of art. And so, but this idea that you kind of need black people to have emotions, to all these kinds of things, and so the sort of that energy of Ellington was liberatory for him, and so where again Coogler sort of talks about that, understands what it really means in a way that again I just find it an interesting. They're going for some of the similar things, but for totally different reasons. And again, the Dudley Murphy thing, fine filmmaker, but more. I think that for me was what the vampire was talking about. He wanted Sammy's soul because he couldn't get his anymore. He said, I want to see my family and all these other things, like what he understood. The griot ability was to talk to all these people. And he can't do it. And so that's why Sammy was important. And so this idea that, and so I just find it interesting that blackness and black music has been co-opted so often because of the fact that it has that ability that Sammy had. But I think Coogler kind of, has a really nice critique of that in a way, but also sort of drawing from like the power of that. I mean, in certain ways, Dudley Murphy was kind of maybe right, that there is something in Ellington that does allow you to feel more than the stuff that he was able to grasp as an artist.
I mean, it's the way that black music actually does a lot of labor for stuff that we wish it wouldn't. So those of you who've seen the film, the soundtrack of a coup d'etat, right, and the way that it talks about how jazz music and jazz musicians in particular were utilized during the Cold War, right, and actually set up the infrastructure for the killing of Lumumba in that context, right? So we have these narratives over and over again. The question I ask for you, Joe, within this context, we have lots of instances of King talking about integration and bringing folks together. You will never see him have written anything or said anything about opening up black churches to white folks, right? Because there was something about that space that needed to remain pristine, even though pristine is a problematic term and means different things to different people.
Yeah, no, I think, there's something about, there's something about, I think, Coogler's film. You mentioned integration or something. There's something about integration that's getting at something like the multiplicity that is the United States, right? So what Charles Long would call the U.S. as a kind of contact zone, right? What I mean by that is, you have, it's the Choctaw kind of community that first warns, like, you might not want to trust these people, right? You might not want to, even as that initial, as you mentioned, the vampire just kind of emerges, right? Is saying that the Choctaw murdered my wife, right? So there's that kind of deception, right? So there's that. There's also the connection between blues and Irish folk songs, right? Irish folk songs, right? Mm-hmm. There's also the way in which, right, like the remaining characters who haven't been bitten yet are in the juke joint. The others are, it seems that they're congregating, right? There's a sense in which they're like, come join us. This is a multicultural kind of, right? Yeah. So there's some kind of juxtaposition happening between that kind of multicultural undead space, right? Mm-hmm. and the violence of the Klan, right?
Right.
Which we say the next day is like, okay, we were going to come in and do the same thing anyway, right? So I can't tell I mean, he's doing something in the juxtaposition. It's unresolved, right? I'm not, and I please don't. I'm not suggesting that liberal multiculturalism is the same thing as the Klan. I'm not saying that.
Right.
Although some would suggest, including people who've written about the Klan and so forth, like Kelly Baker and so forth, would suggest that there's the multiculturalist notion, right, of inclusion and assimilation has moments of overlap with a certain kind of Klan understanding of white supremacy.
I mean, someone made the allusion that it even references Jim Jones.
Oh, yeah.
And Johnstown, right?
Seriously.
When you mentioned that, two things to dive a little bit deeper into, and that is the whole idea of deception, that knock at the door. It's like, don't let them in here. When they, the first is like, oh, we just want to come in, and we don't let them in.
Right.
We think about, our American Indian, Native American, Brits, who, again, we want to embrace everybody, but getting back to the previous point about the why it feels like Black culture is often appropriated or co-opted or used by others, there seems to feel like there is this connectedness with the source. In much of whether it's Black music, Black art, there's this connection with the source that it seems as though others may be trying to access in ways that is sometimes interesting to them, sometimes mysterious to them. I'm not saying it's always the case, but there's an element of that as well.
And often clearly profitable.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, clearly profitable.
We're going to open this up to the audience with some questions, because I'm sure that you have many, and comments.
Yes, and because this is a podcast, hi everyone, we have microphones to pass around. So just raise your hand, we'll pass one to you. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I have a microphone right now. And I just want to ask this question, especially for Franklin. I don't know if you can speak to this or anyone. One of the controversies about this film is that Ryan Coogler penned a deal with the studio that ownership of the film will revert back to him in 25 years. Him being 38 years old, that means that when the film comes back to him, he'll probably be in his 50s. And it really caused a lot of hubbub in Hollywood. It's not unprecedented. Quentin Tarantino did the exact same thing with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood with Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio, and that was fine. But the news headlines coming out of Hollywood was saying, oh no, this is the beginning of the end of the studio system. And a lot of people were saying, why are you saying that because Ryan Coogler got that deal? I don't know if any of you can speak to that, or if Franklin, if you can speak to that. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of obvious that, I mean, it's been interesting to watch how, like the film, the official industry press, like almost universally has been, just kind of like, it's good, but, in all these sort of ways of kind of trying to downplay the real success of the film. And I think, and that's just the most blatant example, I mean, there are very few ways that you can kind of make an argument that it's not just kind of just, brother did it, there's an issue there. Tarantino did it, even though he thinks he's a brother. There's no issue to it. And I think there is something that has been sort of consistent with this. Like when Black Panther had its crazy success, I mean, people probably don't remember because it was like 2018 or something. There was a similar sort of like, they kind of hedging the bets on this. Despite the fact that 2018 you had Black Panther, Ava DuVernay's, I always get the name of that movie mixed up, the one based on the kid's book. Yeah, Wrinkle. It's like, Unbearable Light and Sabine. I mean, I always get these like long titles mixed up. But Wrinkle in Time, like, were the #1, #2 most popular films. And it never happened that, there's always the curse of the first, but it was the first time you have like, a Black woman, a Black man, or two just Black people at the top of the thing. Now, you know, that's an important sort of thing, and but there was the discussion around it at the time in terms of the industry was, I don't know, it was weird, but this for me was like even worse, because in certain ways it's more deniable. Yeah, and again, the fact that it's not like it hadn't been done already, and it's just that, well, you know.
But even in the film, the ownership question is baked in because they're buying the juke joint from Hogwood,
Well,
which is a play on Hollywood. Right?
Yes. Well, I thought that was pretty good. But definitely, I think there's so much that Coogler was very smart about what he did with this film in terms of ownership and all those kinds of things. And honestly, I think some of that came from his knowledge of what happened with black artists in terms of the blues and music and all this kind of stuff, you know. So.
Hi. Thank you all so much for this. Was amazing. Just so many things to say, and I had a question now messed up about this Jim Jones thing. So Megan Goodwin, I work for Religion Dispatches. I am also semi-infamous on the internet for doing a lot of yelling about cults, and the Jonestown parallel is fascinating because so much of the collective memory, obviously, of Jonestown and People's Temple is, you're like mass suicide and everybody was brainwashed, right? But if you look at the history, it is a mass murder of mostly black women and children, right? So that parallel is fascinating.
Yeah.
It's not even a question. That was just, I was too excited not to say anything. I was #blessed to talk to Dr. Shiro about her role in the film and the way that she worked with Ryan Coogler. The article is actually called "I Don't Do Horror, Ryan Coogler," because she was not interested in talking about vampires. She didn't want to do the horror thing, but she did say, and this really unlocked the movie for me, that it is a movie about blues, and it's specifically a movie about blues as the soundtrack to hoodoo, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that's been amazing to see in response to her contributions are both hoodoo practitioners coming out and saying, I felt really seen, but also I don't feel like the movie gave anything away. So I think a number of you talked about the way that the film kind of lures you into wanting to know more history, but doesn't shove it down your throat or give anything away that hasn't been earned, right? So for me, and Dr. Shiro said this first because she's brilliant. If you have not read Black Magic, please go buy it right now. But for her, it was such a teaching moment. This film was teaching you about the history of the blues. It's teaching you about the history of black religion in the United States. I am curious, given that you are all teachers, and I think many of us are teachers, how do you teach through this film? What would you want to pull out for your students? Yeah. Just put you on the spot. Like, you're teachers.
So I guess two things. Thank you, Ray, for that question. I think maybe two things that I'm thinking about right now. In light of what I think you were gesturing toward and what I think came out in the conversation, the interview between you and Dr. Shiro, is, we've been talking about issues of appropriation, right? But there's a concern about the way in which universities appropriate knowledge, Native Indigenous knowledge, right? Like, so this idea of both revealing but keeping secret, I think that's something, right? Especially, since, I'm teaching in these spaces where these things happen, I think that would be really important. I also think for me, this was, one of the talking points that we perhaps could have talked about that Lou put out there. I might think about notions of pessimism versus futurism, right? Yeah. I might think about some of those things. I might think about the way in which, one could read this as like Coolidge thinking about the kind of multiplicity and plurality of the democratic, but he could also be focusing on antagonism, ongoing anti-blackness, right? The way in which at the end, the initial last scene, right? I mean, the first last scene where 60 years later or so in Chicago, right? Well, I'm not giving too much away, but I'll just 60 years later in Chicago, where Sammy, and it's Stack and Mary, right? Kind of come back in, and they say, yeah, I had this one moment of freedom, right? Right. So there's like, it almost seems like options are, right, your soul gets stuck in a body forever, right? You have to become part of the vampiric, right? Which, to go back to your point, like, this is how Marx talked about capitalism. It is dead capital, like taking the life and blood of living capital, right? And so, you either have that, or you have another kind of death, which Annie talks about, right? Which is getting to the other side because they have people waiting for them, including their daughter. Right. So anyway, right. So I would think about those two things. But.
And I hope you would think about delving into women and power, because there were powerful women in this film. Yeah. So, but since I'm not teaching and you all are.
You are.
Hopefully, I think everybody can see me. So I always like to introduce myself. My name is Christopher Newman. Proud Duke alumni, received my Master's of Theological Studies and was a student of Dr. Winter. So it's definitely a pleasure to be here. And Dr. Shiro, I absolutely am a massive fan of your work. I kind of work with looking at the fantasy and the demonization of Creole, Afro-Creole, and Afro-Caribbean religions in the 19th century and the white imagination. So with that said, I have two questions. My first question is, and this is to everyone on the panel, the relationship of the Irish, and particularly from a historical perspective, and the relationship and how the Irish at one point in time were allies of enslaved black individuals. I think that played a large role, even though it wasn't really explained that deeply. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, like how the Irish represented themselves and how they were represented in the film. And then also the last scene of the movie, what I brought from that, or what I took away from that, is that it was actually a reverse of the ending of Night of the Living Dead, where the black gentleman, I can't remember his character's name, he was the only one that survived, this apocalyptic type of situation, and here arrives white police, and they shoot him. However, in this film, it is an absolute reverse, where the white police or the Klan arrive to murder this black man, but he's ready for them. So I don't know if anyone kind of got that as well, but I did want to ask that question as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can talk a little bit about the Irish thing, just the specifics of. Oh, sorry, I keep forgetting. Just the specifics of Remick, the character in the film, and this, I think, is one of Coogler's strengths as a writer. Going back to, say, Killmonger in Panther, the ability to create a quote-unquote villain that, to a certain degree, you find ways that you can say that they've got a point. Yeah, I mean, and so in certain ways, throughout the film, you are invited as the audience to kind of see that, there's a shared history of colonialism, shared history in terms of the religious aspects of that, the way that religion can be used in sort of political power, shared sort of richness of music. I mean, Irish is a very sort of rich sort of musical history. And again, the real history, I mean, having the Choctaw there, knowing that there was like a link between sort of historical between Choctaw and Irish.
And the Chinese American.
Yeah, yes. So this idea that at one level, the easy thing to be would just be some random white guy as the vampire. It could be easily, then that's the thesis of, like, of the sort of blood-sucking sort of capitalist sort of thing. And so I think the thing that made it interesting, because it wasn't that easy. You know, I used to teach a class on sort of ethnic cinema, sort of American cinema, really sort of focusing on ethnic cinema, and part of that was looking at Irish cinema. But one of the things I also felt I kind of had to do was give people a little bit of a history lesson. I used to show like one old photos where you had two sort of caricature figures, both kind of sort of simian figures and things like that. And I was like, oh, who is this? You know, and basically it's like Irish and African. I mean, they were made to look alike. I mean, they were treated, you know, they were thought of in sort of the same vein. And you know, there's that sort of famous book like How the Irish Became White. And so I thought it was a very smart choice to have the vampire be, one, someone who could appreciate the gift that Sammy had. I think that was part of it, but also someone who couldn't just be a villain. And, you know, because that would just kind of end the conversation. Now it's a much more complicated conversation, because again, this idea that in certain ways he's talking about integration and talking about assimilation and all these kind of things, like, all sounds good, but the idea that, you know, what you lose, I think someone's saying, like, what you lose when you get that, what you lose when you let them into the church, you know, how much to protect the sacred. So I thought it was a smart choice, and I think it cancels any of the sort of argument about sort of like it's a pure conversation about this black-white thing, in the sense that, yeah, I just thought it was a smart thing to do. Again, that was what I liked about Killmonger in the Black Panther, because again, you know, I mean, in certain ways, he actually kind of wins part of his argument. You know, he convinces T'Challa to open up. So, you know, and so, I mean, clearly, you know, he's also killing a lot of people. So, same with Remick. He's, you know, saying all this stuff that he's saying, you know, that he's got this connection that's a real connection. He's also a vampire that's, you know, basically trying to cut people off from the rest of their souls. So.
How many of you have seen the movie?
Yeah, I feel like, okay, good.
All right. And I raised that question in a very specific sense, and this is a bit of a sidebar. My wife and I went to see The Wiz last night in the theater. And it's not a film I've ever particularly liked, because I didn't see it in the theater. And I saw it in the theater last night. It's like, oh, I get it, right? Because it doesn't make sense on a TV screen or on a computer screen. How important is it to have a film, particularly post-pandemic, right? And some of you, maybe not Jill, but you know, might be old enough to remember what it was like when Spike Lee dropped a film in the late 1980s, right? And how important it was to they were events, right? How important is it to have a film that's made now that has recreated that sense that, no, you can't wait for it to stream, right? You need to actually go to a theater, and even more so, right? You need to find where it's being screened on IMAX to have the full experience.
Can I
yeah, of course.
Just say one thing real quick? When Black Panther came out, I was teaching film in NC State at that point, and I got asked by twice to sort of like talk about it. Like one, I had a group of students that came with me, watched it, and then talked about it afterwards and things like that. And I had seen it once by myself, then I saw it with my wife, then I saw it with like these two groups. So I saw it like 4 times. Every single time I saw something different. And so, you know, and but the thing that was, the students one was like, that's you know, it's just nice to have students have that conversation, talking about the transnational aspects of it. Like so many of the actors are sort of internationally known. His drawing from independent film history in the same way that Julie Dash did in Daughters of the Dust, by having, so there's all this stuff there. all the research, whatever. But the significant thing for me, and this goes back to Daughters of the Dust, was like when I was, I saw that, when it came out in Chicago, and at the Art Institute has a huge theater, almost all black audience. People were dressed. Hair was, and it was just nice. I hadn't seen anything like that. I mean, I saw I saw School Days in the theater, and the thing that shocked me was like, well, this was in Minnesota. So not a lot of black folk in Minnesota, but they were all in that theater. In Minneapolis, I should say. And talking back, and it's just like, people were taking sides of that whole, black, jigaboo. And it was just, and for me, coming up, a small town in North Carolina, this was like, not what I expected to see in Minneapolis, but also it was just nice, and the people were invested. But with Daughters of the Dust, people were sort of the cultural expression was in the room. But I hadn't seen anything like that until Black Panther came out. And the same thing, people go to see the movie over and over. Wakanda Forever comes out, again, fine film, but it wasn't that same event. Yeah. So now I'm finding people talking about going to see Sinners like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. I mean, and it's a different thing. People aren't sort of dressed up so much in the finest kente, but they don't have to. In certain ways, they're bringing themselves in a way, in certain ways, where I think Coogler mentioned that Black Panther was a way for, he had to go to Africa in certain ways, but he forgot about his own roots. And so in certain ways, this is his attempt to do the same thing with the research and all that stuff. And I think that's why people are seeing it. So there's something about the film, I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I haven't seen that since Daughters of the Dust and Black Panther.
Okay, I'm just thinking about like I'm just trying to think about the differences in context, right? The different kind of dynamics and shifts between, like, let's say 1988. Because I do remember School Days, and then Do the Right Thing and so forth when they were events. And I'm thinking also about our colleague Wanima Lubiano's concern with a figure like Spike Lee, right? She has a really important essay back in 1991-92, real but compared to what? It's a Roberta Flack, rest in peace song that she's kind of drawing from. And it wasn't so much about Spike Lee, but the way in which Spike Lee was being positioned as the voice of black people, right? As the authentic representation of black people. And she was like, what that does is it kind of overshadows, right, other ways, particularly independent filmmakers, right, like Charles Burnett or Julie Dash, right, who are giving us maybe more unconventional representations of black people, black women, unconventional sexuality and so forth. And I'm wondering if that's still kind of a problem, or if there's just so many other venues that people have, right, Netflix films, different things, that there might be other, the field might be much more variegated and multiplicitous, but I don't know. But that's one thing I thought about.
I think it's still an issue, but because as we know, this is great, and there's much more for us to see, and more directors and more films. But I still think, unfortunately, some of the conversations I've had with people who did not like the film was because they took some things very literally. Again, I see it as an art film. I'm examining it from this approach as I would anything else. They took it literally. They felt like it was anti-church. They felt like it was I'm serious. There's some very strong emotion like that, and I raise it because I like your opinion on that. And in one instance, a family member, her daughter, explained, look, this is the perspective of it. Look at it this way. It's not, and particularly I think it left some with the impression that, we are the pessimism, I guess. We are hopeless, we are defeated. It's saying that evil defeats. So some people really are taking it literally. And, so from your perspective, how would you talk about that?
The pessimism kind of, that's a good. So, well, I think one thing we haven't. This allows me to bring up the real last scene, which I was talking to, Courtney and Megan about this earlier. where the character Sammy, right, as a younger person, is playing This Little Light of Mine, right? But now in a blues, of the blues version of that, right? So as some of us were talking about earlier, right? It's like, well, no, this continues on beyond the movie, right? There's something about this, but there's still, it's the blues, right? So the blues, again, we could talk about, there's so many people who've talked about the blues, musicians, artists, from, I'm thinking of Gail Jones, Corregidora, Ralph Ellis has talked about it. But the blues brings together, it seems to me, the tragic and the beautiful, right? Or the tragic and the comic, right? And so maybe it allows, at least for me, to maybe think beyond any dichotomy between pessimism and optimism, something like that. That makes sense.
We'll take one last question from Natalie Bullock Brown.
Yes. Thank you, y'all. This has been so incredible. I want to make a comment and then I want to ask a question. So I wanted to just lift up what has been talked about in terms of this connection between the spiritual and the secular. I would love for Joseph to talk about the baptism scene. And then also, like, to Lois's point about, like, praise and worship and this idea of being caught up in the spirit. Remick has his moment, right, when he's doing the Irish jig.
Yeah.
He looks like he has been taken over. So I just wanted to raise that. But Lois, you also talked about or mentioned women in power. And I really want you all to talk about Annie,
Yep.
because I've seen on social media comments that say she is a mammy.
What?
Yeah.
Obviously, they didn't see the film.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and I
Don't know much about mammies.
that, but I feel like Ryan is doing something that is feminist in the way that Annie is positioned,
Yes.
her guidance and navigation through the violence, through the vampires. She is the one who knows what to do, right? So I feel like she represents a hashtag Trust Black Women.
Right.
So I would love for y'all to start something.
And real talk, I could watch the whole film just looking.
Right. Well, Natalie, you just clearly articulated, my feelings on it, which is that Annie was a very complex character. She had an intuitive knowing. She practiced her own faith, her own spiritual practice that kept her grounded. When he came back, that scene, it was interesting because at the very beginning, when he first walked into her house, I think it was, when Smoke first walked in, I couldn't tell if maybe they were relatives. You know what I mean? When you've been away and you walk in, because again, I'm from the country. You walk in, you're up in somebody's house, and you greet them warmly. It took a minute and I love the way he designed that scene to realize that, oh, there's something there, and it was very sensual, and it was a powerful scene because you could feel the intensity of emotion between them. It wasn't just. Anyway. So I think that was a very beautiful scene. But even when the stuff started, before I had to leave for the vampire scene and stuff, she was the one who said, no, don't let them in here. She had that no, and it's like, no, let's test this. So she had a level of not just, it was intuitive knowing, she had authority and influence, right? It was clear that she had, again, and she was just firmly grounded in that throughout that movie. So I just think she really represented both sort of power, regardless of whether it's feminine or masculine. It doesn't need to be gendered. But I think she was just a very powerful figure in a lot of ways in that film.
Yeah. One thing I would add, I think I totally agree with everything. One thing I would add to that is, to go back to your question about political economy, right? She was the one who was like, when I think it was Stack was like, we're not going to allow them to use these plantation coins, right, as currency, right? We're going to have real currency, right? And she was the one who was like, oh no, wait a minute, these people worked hard for this, right? So I was even just thinking about like, multiple notions of currency, what it means to, attach value to labor and different things like that. So yeah, without a doubt, and I also. Just to kind of go back, just throughout the film, like you said, there's this kind of black feminist kind of knowledge of healing, right? But but also, and this is, okay, I'm gonna be quiet after this, but I'm also right now reading Octavia Butler's Fledgling, right, which is another vampire, right? But she's also like, because you see in vampire films, it's like, okay, the vampire creature is on one hand the supernatural fantasy thing, but always in films and in books, it's like people have some knowledge of vampires. It's like, well, does garlic kill them, right? Or is it sunlight? Right? If you look in the mirror, something like that. But she knows, right?
Yeah.
We're all taking garlic right now, right? You know, as a way, or you know, a certain kind of water, different things like that, stakes in the heart. So and she knows the distinction too between a haint, right, and a vampire, right? I thought that was So I think she's a crucial figure. Oh yeah, the best. Okay, real quick. So I'll just say that. I'll just say this. You got me thinking. There are certain kind of. I'm thinking of certain, maybe lesser known slave narratives. I'm thinking about the Jerain Ali, for instance, right, where actually, right, her baptism is described as almost like a drowning, right? It's almost like being drowned, right? So it's complicated. It's complicated, right? But there does seem to, like, there's that moment of, I think you're talking about the moment with Remy and so forth, right? And Sammy, there does seem to be like a moment where, right, like drowning, baptism, death, which baptism is a certain kind of spiritual death, and opening up to a new type of life. Exactly. Right. Exactly. Submission. Exactly. No, exactly. And I think, yeah, I mean, I thought about this in terms of, recently I rewatched Beyonce's Lemonade, the right, and like and all the water. So you got, flooding, inundation.
Right.
So water can be both life-giving and destructive at the same time.
Yeah, and you know, the baptism scene too, it reminded me, because I didn't see the whole thing. I'm notorious for seeing but I mean the snippets of rewatching the Nat Turner film, the one that was done, what's his name? Yeah. And the whole thing about the fact that they wanted the white plantation person wanted Nat Turner to baptize him, and that was, you know, that was taboo. It was against the law. So that came to mind as well. And being somebody who really was baptized outside the church in a pool, there is all this, you know, as a 10-year-old, there is this feeling of, you know, submersion, and it's like, okay, am I going to drown here? Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon.
Blacks, they be hyping, I'm the light that lit your match. A black watch for all the times I watch MTV raps. Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back. Black.